Hello and welcome to today's webinar on post-market surveillance for medical devices and combination products. If a device is FDA cleared or approved, can we assume it's safe and effective? This is a really timely topic, and I think it's important not just for those of you who are in the US, but also anywhere in the world, because we have a responsibility to deal with post-market surveillance for our products. I'm really excited about this presentation, and let's just get into it here in a moment. But my name is John Spear, and I'm the founder and VP of Quality and Regulatory at Greenlight Guru, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's event. As I'm sure you can imagine, there's a really special presentation for today, and I know our presenter, Mike Drews, is really looking forward to sharing his valuable insights and regulatory expertise on post-market surveillance for medical devices and combination products. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our presenter and his consultancy, Vascular Sciences, I'm going to touch on a few items real quick. Yes, absolutely. Every single webinar we ever do at Greenlight Guru is recorded. Yes, you will have access to the replay of this. There will be a link sent to your email sometime probably later today, maybe tomorrow, with the replay link, as well as access to the slides. And yes, the webinar will be available on the Greenlight Guru website as well. So if after you go through this today and you think others in your organization should take part in this, it's available. It will be available on demand here in a few days. So absolutely, I want to address that first and foremost because that's always the most common question that we get. The webinar is going to run for about 60 minutes or so, and Mike has offered to stick around for a few minutes at the tail end of this to address any questions that you might have. So throughout today's presentation, I would encourage you to jot down your questions as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we'll get to as many of those as time permits at the tail end of today's presentation. I'd like to share a few words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on these free training sessions. If you've been on one of these training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. And this is likely a mission that's very similar to many of you who are participating in today's webinar. So anything that we can do as an organization that helps device makers design, develop, and manufacture safer, life-changing devices and get those to market faster with less risk really aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultant like today's presenter, Mike Drews, or through the award-winning Greenlight Guru medical device QMS software platform. Those are all ways that we do that. So if you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from across the globe are moving away from paper-based and general-purpose quality management systems and adopting a purpose-built medical device quality management software, then I would encourage you to go to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation to schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. In doing so, you'll learn how the very best medical device companies are leveraging the purpose-built quality management software to gain ISO 13485 certification, market approvals and clearances, breeze through audits and inspections, and push beyond just compliance to produce true quality medical devices. So again, if you're interested in learning how we can help your medical device company, make sure you visit www.greenlight.guru after today's webinar and schedule your personalized demo. So now let's get on to today's presentation, and let me give a proper introduction to your presenter and a distinguished partner of ours here at Greenlight Guru, Mike Drews, and someone I'm proud to call a friend. Mike Drews, PhD, is president of Vascular Sciences, a consulting and training company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission design, FDA presentation preparation, and defense. Dr. Drews received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in biomedical engineering from Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa. He has worked for and consulted with leading medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies ranging in size from startups to Fortune 100 companies. He also works on a regular basis for FDA, Health Canada, the US and European patent offices, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and other regulatory and government agencies around the world. Mike is an internationally recognized expert and featured keynote speaker on cutting edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs. He conducts seminars and short courses for medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech companies, and regulatory and government agencies alike. Finally, as an adjunct professor of medicine, biomedical engineering, and biotechnology, Dr. Drews teaches graduate courses in regulatory affairs and clinical trials, clinical trial design, medical device regulatory affairs and product development, combination products, pathophysiology, medical technology, and biotechnology at several universities and medical schools on premise and online. So, without further ado, let me hand it over to today's presenter, Dr. Drews. Mike, it's always funny to call you Dr. Drews, but anyway, I guess you have those credentials, so take it away.
Well, please don't call me doctor. That's fine, John. Thank you very much for that very kind and somewhat long introduction. A special thank you to you and my other friends at Greenlight Guru for the invitation to conduct this webinar today. And obviously, a very special thank you to those of you in the audience who are listening either right now or in the future, because without you, we would all be just wasting our time. So as John said, the purpose of today's webinar is to talk a bit about post-market surveillance in the context of medical devices primarily, and a little bit about combination products. Before we do, I just want to reiterate just one thing that John mentioned about my background. In addition to consulting for a wide variety of medical device companies, I also work as a consultant for the FDA as well as Health Canada and a few of the other regulatory agencies around the world. And the reason why I point that out, quite frankly, is because not a lot of people can say that. Not a lot of people work on that, both sides of that proverbial fence. And so I really try to use that to my advantage. And just the last thing that I want to share with you is if you're interested in more information, not just about this particular topic, but a variety of topics relating to medical device technology and regulatory affairs and so on, I would invite you to check out any of the following websites. I do a lot of podcasts with Greenlight Guru as well as other organizations. So there are links here. Check it out as you're interested. Okay, before getting into the topic of post-market surveillance, I just kind of want to see where we are as an audience. I want to start out with just a few simple polling questions. The first one is, are you currently conducting any post-market surveillance? Followed by, are you currently conducting, if you're conducting post-market surveillance, are you currently conducting passive post-market surveillance? If you don't know what that is, we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Are you currently conducting active post-market surveillance? And then my favorite question in this series are you doing a good job conducting post-market surveillance? So, John, why don't we share those questions with the audience, and if you want to just take a couple of seconds to respond, either yes or no or I don't know, I'd be curious to see the results.
All right, and we'll launch these one at a time. We'll give everybody a few seconds or so to respond. So let's launch the first poll. Are you currently conducting any post-market surveillance? Yes, no, I don't know, / I'm not sure. People are responding very quickly, Mike.
Good.
All right, so we got about 80% of participants who have responded. Results: yes, 68%; no, 25%; I don't know, 7%.
Okay.
All right,
thank you. Let's move on to the next question.
All right, terrific. So, are you currently conducting passive post-market surveillance? Again, same responses: yes, no, I don't know, / I'm not sure. All right, a little bit slower come in. We got about 80% of the results now. 53% yes, 26% no, 22% I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Let's move on to the third one about active post-market surveillance.
All right, are you currently conducting active post-market?
And again, if you're not familiar with the difference between passive and active, don't worry about it. We'll talk about that in just a moment.
All right, we just shy of 80%, but results on this one, 38% yes, 44% no, and 18% I don't know, I'm not sure.
Interesting. Okay, and finally, the last question: are you doing a good job, whatever that means, conducting post-market surveillance?
Mike, your questions are always so thought-provoking, so I always appreciate when you put these in.
Well, I just thought of a question that I should have added to the list, John, and that is, if you're conducting post-market surveillance today, are you doing it the same way that you did, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago?
Yeah, well,
But
that
I
might
didn't.
be,
I didn't.
that might,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that might be a nice thing for people to chime in as they add their questions. So think
They
about
certainly
that,
can.
folks. Same or
So, what
different?
percentage of our audience is doing a good job of PMS, John?
So 19% yes, 36% no, and 44% I don't know, I'm not sure.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I appreciate everybody's participation, and I especially appreciate your candor and your honesty, especially when it comes to that last question. Are you doing a good job? Because for those of you that have listened to any of my stuff in the past, you know that I do not assume that just because you're meeting the regulatory requirements, that is, that you're ticking the regulatory boxes, so to speak, that you're doing a good job. So interesting that only about 20% of our audience actually thinks that they're doing a good job conducting post-market surveillance. So that to me means that there's room for improvement. And to be able to acknowledge what we don't do well is a great place to start. Where I have a problem is with people who think they're doing a great job, even in fact when they're not. But let me not get ahead of myself. Let's continue on and get into the subject matter. So here are a list of bullets. I'm not going to go through them individually, that I'm hoping to talk about either directly or indirectly in the short time that we have together under this very broad umbrella of post-market surveillance. It's an incredibly broad topic, and we can probably do an entire webinar on each and every one of these bullets. So in the time that we have together, I'm going to try to cover them as best as I can. But as I go through this, I want you to remember one of my many favorite adages, and that is, there's no better way to avoid finding a problem than not to look for one. There's no better way to avoid finding a problem than not to look for one. And regrettably, when it comes to post-market surveillance, this applies 110%. It's very difficult sometimes to convince companies to continue to monitor a product while it's already on the market. After all, they say, we've already spent the time and the money getting it onto the market. Some would even go so far as to say, well, we've already got our 510(k) clearance, our PMA approval, our CE mark, whatever it is. Therefore, why do we have to worry about anything? Our product is perfect. Well, we all know that in spite of our best attempts, our products are not always perfect. And we do have an obligation, whether you want to call it a regulatory obligation, an ethical obligation, what have you, to continue to monitor these products while they're in use on the market. Unfortunately, as we're going to talk about, this is not something that our industry has a particularly good track record of doing. It's just a simple reality of the world. To be fair, I'm not singling out the medical device industry here, but it's equally applicable, perhaps even more applicable to the to the pharmaceutical industry. Post-market surveillance historically for both drugs as well as medical devices is not something that our industry has done a very good job at. We are getting better, as we'll discuss, largely because of some of the very high-profile problems that have developed, and we are increasing the regulatory requirements, both in the EU as well as here in the US and in other places of the world, again, as we will discuss in a little bit more detail. But the root cause, if you will, for these increasing regulatory requirements is the adage that you see on the screen. There's no better way to avoid finding a problem than not to look for one. So before I share with you my information about post-market surveillance, I just want to very quickly give you a couple of other resources. First of all, the FDA has a variety of information on their website. I would, as a starting point you to this particular one that talks about post-market requirements for medical devices. My friends at Greenlight Guru also have a section of their website devoted to post-market surveillance, and they have a lot of great information there. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reiterating what FDA says or what Greenlight or other people say, because I want to go much further than that. We're going to go beyond the obvious, beyond the basics. And as I kind of hinted at it a moment ago, let's not forget about applying the concept of post-market surveillance from the drug world to medical devices. One of my many frustrations about working in this industry, especially with regulatory folks, we have a lot of people that have a lot of experience, for example, with medical devices. We have other people that have a lot of experience with drugs or biologics, but we don't have a lot of people with a lot of experience on both sides of that fence. And that's a real problem, because a lot of the common challenges with post-market surveillance are exactly the same on the device side of the world compared to the drugs. And for those of you that are interested in combination products, which is clearly the future of medicine, this is another big challenge. How do we have an intelligent conversation about combination products, whether it's in terms of post-market surveillance or product development or something else, if we don't first know what it is that we're combining? So to the extent that I can, in the limited time that we have, I want to share with you a little bit from the drug side of the world as well as the combination product side of the world, so that we can try to see the similarities between them. So let's start out, as we're getting the brain juices flowing here, with a seemingly simple question, and that is, what is post-market surveillance, or PMS? Well, the textbook answer might be something like monitoring the safety of a product, for example, a medical device, after it's been released on the market, after it's gotten FDA clearance or approval, or it's gotten a CE mark and is now currently on the market. I'm not going to say that that's an incorrect definition of post-market surveillance. What I will say, it's a very myopic, it's a very limited definition of post-market surveillance, because indeed, post-market surveillance is a heck of a lot more than what the textbook will have you believe. Is it really so simple? Is this cartoon, or is this ad from the TV so easy that a caveman can do it? First of all, where are we talking about the post-market surveillance? If you have a product on the market here in the U.S., for example, and you experience problems in the EU or elsewhere in the world, are we required under U.S. regulation to monitor what's happening in the EU? And if we do, are we then required to report those EU problems back here in the United States? And obviously, that street runs in two directions. If you have a product, a device on the market in the EU that has problems in, say, the U.S. or somewhere else, under the EU regulation, are we required to monitor what's happening outside the EU and the US, for example? And if we do, if we experience any problems, are we required to report them back to the EU? Another aspect that I think is interesting is, how long are we required to do post-market surveillance? If a product is on the market for a year, for a decade, let's say you've had a device on the market for maybe 50 years, are you required to do post-market surveillance over a period of 50 years? And finally, the most important limitation of the definition of post-market surveillance is, why focus only on safety-related issues when it comes to post-market surveillance? To me, that is so inside-the-box thinking. It is such a myopic view. What about efficacy? One of the things I'm going to talk about towards the end of the webinar is using post-market surveillance, whether it's a randomized clinical trial or real-world evidence, to expand your label, to add a new indication to your device that you don't have on it right now. That's another very useful aspect of post-market surveillance. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the unfortunate connotation of post-market surveillance to most people is very negative. And in other words, looking for problems. But that's only one side of the PMS coin. The other side of the PMS coin is looking for opportunities, looking for new markets, new indications that we can get into via a label expansion, as I'll talk about later. In the drug world, this is very, very closely related to something called pharmacovigilance. Unfortunately, I don't hear many people talking about pharmacovigilance in the device world, perhaps because the word pharmacovigilance starts with the prefix pharma, which sort of means drugs. But beyond that, what does pharmacovigilance really mean? It's simply the detection, understanding, and prevention of either acute or chronic adverse events. So they're focusing on the negative again, not just the positive, of regulated medical products. That includes, obviously, drugs, but it also includes everything else, including medical devices and combination products. The question is, does pharmacovigilance or does post-market surveillance work? Well, the answer to that is not so well. Here's an interesting statistic from the drug side of the world, and only an estimated 10% of all drug-related adverse events are actually reported to manufacturers or regulators. If we spin that to the other way, that means that about 90% of drug-related adverse events are not reported to manufacturers or to regulators. And regrettably, for medical devices, it's even worse. By some accounts, only as low as 3 to 5% of adverse events related to medical devices are reported to manufacturers and to regulators. Let me say that one more time. 3 to 5%. That means that if I do the arithmetic correctly, spun the other way, 95 to 97% of adverse events are not being reported to you as the manufacturers or to the FDA as the regulators. You know, the late great Carl Sagan said that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we don't necessarily have reports of problems with our medical device doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't problems, doesn't necessarily mean that that everything is working perfectly. And this gets into, as we'll talk about in a moment, the difference between passive post-market surveillance, which is what the vast majority of companies do, versus active post-market surveillance, which is regrettably not what a lot of companies do, although that statistic is increasing. So obviously, most of you in the audience are familiar with the medical device development process. And the question is, where does post-market surveillance fit in? Well, the most obvious answer, the textbook answer, would be in the red circle on the right. This is after your 510K, your PMA, what have you, while the product is on the market. But is it really as simple as that? No, absolutely not. What about the concept of what I call pre-market, post-market surveillance? In other words, is it possible? This sounds like a double entendre, but it's really not. Is it possible to do post-market surveillance prior to your device being actually on the market? Well, most people would probably say no. In fact, they would probably say, oh my God, what is this Drew's guy talking about? He must be a wackadoodle. He must be nuts. Well, it's definitely possible, and here's what I mean by that. What if you have a device on the market for one indication, and as we'll talk about later, you are looking to do a label expansion to add a second indication? I've got some examples of this I'll share with you later. And so in terms of the second indication, you're still pre-market on that one because you haven't got the label expansion finished yet. But you can take advantage of the post-market information that you have from the other, from the same device with the other indication. In other words, let me try to explain it this way. So if you have a device with one indication and you have exactly the same device with a second indication, in the eyes of the regulatory system, in the eyes of the FDA, even though the device itself is exactly the same and the only thing that's different is the labeling, in fact, what we're really talking about is two different devices. So bottom line, yes, it is possible to do post-market surveillance on a device that's still pre-market, as we'll talk about with the label expansion. Okay, so now that we've talked about a little bit about what PMS is and how does it fit in the product development life cycle, the next logical question is, why do we bother doing post-market surveillance? Well, regrettably, I think the answer that most people are going to give is because it's required. But let me be crystal clear. To me, doing something because it's required is not a good reason to do anything. Every day, not just as a regulatory consultant, but as a professional biomedical engineer, I read regulation that makes absolutely no sense, and yet people do it anyway. So just doing something because it's required to me, is not a good justification. There always needs to be good justification for what it is that we do. And equally, if not more important, they should be good justification for what it is that we don't do. So doing PMS just because it's required is not good enough for me. So are there better reasons? The answer is yes. The most obvious, and this is the textbook answers we talked about in a moment ago, looking for safety issues, looking for problems that for whatever reasons we did not detect during the development process of the device. And then the other, that's sort of focusing on the stick, but focusing on the carrot of the PMS is on the efficacy side. As I said, looking for new opportunities, new ways to make money, quite frankly, by being able to market your device for other indications, what we call a label expansion. So that's why we really do post-market surveillance. Looking for safety problems, that's an obvious one, but looking for new opportunities in terms of efficacy, that's a very good one as well. Some people would argue that, if, as I mentioned a moment ago, if we get a 510K clearance, if we get a de novo granted, if we get a PMA approved, if we get a CE mark, if we get that permission to market by whatever regulatory authority in the part of the world that we happen to be dealing with, isn't that enough? I mean, aren't we supposed to show that our products are safe and effective as part of that clearance or approval process? Well, the simple reality is it's not always enough. Think about it this way. Actually, I'm going to take that off for just a second. Think about it this way. In the medical device world, as most of you in the audience know, only a very, very small number of devices that we use today have undergone a clinical trial. Here's a statistic for you that some of you may be familiar with. Only about, let me say it this way, about 95% of medical devices that we use today here in the United States, about 95% of them have never undergone a clinical trial, which means only about 5%, maybe 10 at the most, but probably closer to 5, have actually undergone a clinical trial. So many times in the medical device world, and this is obviously a big difference to drugs, but many times in the medical device world, the first time that we get clinical information is after the product is on the market. So that's another reason why it's so important to do to do post-market surveillance, because we don't often have good clinical data to support safety and efficacy. If we, using the 510K as an example, if we show that our device is substantially equivalent, i.e. basically the same as another device, and the other device is already on the market, and that device is assumed to be safe and effective. Therefore, we assume our device to be safe and effective. In other words, the regulatory logic is very simple. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. We use this in the 510K world all the time. That regulatory logic works frequently, but it does not work all the time. And this is, not to go off on a tangent here, but this is exactly why, pardon me, the 510K has become so controversial. But post-market surveillance is important for all products, but especially products that we don't have a lot of information on pre-market in terms of clinical use. Here's an adage that I used to share with my medical students back in the day when I used to teach medical school. And this is something that everybody knows, but you'll never find it written in a book. This is referring to a drug. Wait 1 year before prescribing a new drug, and if it's for a family member, wait 5 years. Now, obviously, this sounds like a terrible thing, but the unfortunate reality is that there are many people, including some physicians, who will assume that when FDA approves a product, everything that we would like to know about that product is known. And simply put, for a whole bunch of different reasons, that's not necessarily the case. Is it any different for medical devices? Absolutely not. It's sort of a riff on what is safety, how safe is safe, how much testing is enough. How much testing do we need to do pre-market to show our device is safe and effective, whatever those terms mean, versus what can we try to look at after it's on the market to get it onto the market sooner. Again, not to get into too much detail on the clinical trial side, but this is the whole justification, the philosophical basis for post-market surveillance. In other words, if we are testing a device in a clinical trial, how many people are we potentially harming because they don't have access to that particular device because they can't get it because it's still in a clinical trial? The other side of that teeter-totter is if we test a product in a clinical trial and it appears to be safe and effective and we release it, but then what is the probability of people getting harmed because we didn't test it enough? We didn't test it on enough patients. We didn't test it over a long enough period of time. Forget about what the regulation says about post-market surveillance. That's not the important part. What's the most important part to understand is what is the philosophical basis? What is the reason why we do, or we're supposed to do anyway, post-market surveillance? It simply acknowledges that no matter how much we test a product pre-market, we never can test it enough. And so post-market surveillance is a way to get a product onto the market to try to help people sooner, but at the same time, kind of keep an eye on it to detect problems that we didn't detect before, either because they're very infrequent, either because they happen over very long periods of time, and so on and so on. Okay, continuing on, let's come back to this question of passive and active post-market surveillance and start to weave into another of my favorite topics to talk about, and that is product liability. So what's the difference between passive and active post-market surveillance? Simply put, and by the way, these are my definitions, these are not FDA's or anybody else's. Passive PMS, as you can imagine, simply means that we wait for problems to come to us. In other words, problems are reported to us from a user, from a physician, from whoever it is, as opposed to active post-market surveillance, where we actually proactively go out and look for them. We contact doctors and say, hey, we haven't heard from you for a while. We just want to make sure that our laparoscopic device that you're using is working okay. Are there any issues that you've noticed that for whatever reasons you have not shared with us before? That's what I mean by active post-market surveillance. This is not something that a lot of companies do, although it is always one of the suggestions. That I make to companies, don't just wait for problems to come to you. Actually go out and look for them. I encourage companies in their quality management systems, for example, to define this. You know, we're going to do literature searches on a periodic basis, whether it's once a month, once a quarter, once a year, whatever it is, and define what the literature search terms that you're using, and so on. If you have a 510K device, are you only looking at problems associated with your particular device? Do you need to look at problems that were associated with the predicate device? Because after all, if your device is similar to the predicate and the predicate is experiencing problems, then it stands to reason you should not have to have a PhD in biomedical engineering to understand that, you know, a similar problem might happen in your device. And you, as a medical device manufacturer, have an obligation, never mind a regulatory obligation, but an ethical obligation to at least investigate a little bit to see if the problem in the predicate might happen to you. And what about beyond the predicate? What about the other devices that are out there that are not necessarily your 510K predicate, but are very similar to your device as well? In my opinion, we have an obligation to take a broader look of the universe. In some other places in the world, that is a regulatory requirement. Regrettably, here in the U.S., not quite so much. So in most cases, when it comes to what the regulation actually requires, passive post-market surveillance, which is sufficient for low to moderate risk devices. But as I hinted at a moment ago, is that enough? In my opinion, not enough. This is when the product liability implications come in. I'm spending a fair amount of my time now acting as a expert witness in medical device product liability cases. And when it comes to problems with the device, one of the first things that I look at is, did the manufacturer do active or passive post-market surveillance? And to what extent did they do it? Did they look only at their device? Did they look at the predicate device? Did they look beyond the predicate device? One of the things that I will say, if necessary, if they didn't look beyond the predicate device, for example, one thing you have to understand about product liability, I don't want to go too far down this hole, but my product liability attorney friends don't limit me to just what FDA requires, because they want from me to know what the company should have done as a professional biomedical engineer, and to me, it is not overly burdensome. It is not unreasonable to expect a company periodically to look for problems beyond just their device or even their predicate. I think that's something that we can do literally in a very short period of time. So what do you look at? As I said, your device, do you stop there? I hope not. Your predicate device, similar devices. What about even further than that? What about devices that are different, used in different parts of the body, for example, but rely on the same technology? So if there's a problem with that technology in gastroenterology and you're using the same or similar technology in urology or cardiology, are you supposed to go into other ologies of medicine to see if there are problems? That's the essence of post-market surveillance. Everybody agrees that it's important, but how much? Where do we draw that line? When and where do we look? How frequently do we do this? Do we do it weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly? As I said, do we limit it to just what is reported to us, i.e. passive? Or what about going beyond that, using databases from the FDA and other places, using the literature? And if we're going to use the literature, do we limit it to the medical literature, to the popular press? Bottom line, you're not going to find the answers to any of these questions, at least not directly in the regulation. This is all up to you. It's up to you as professional medical device developers or regulatory professionals or whatever your role happens to be, is to understand the principles of post-market surveillance that we're talking about here and then apply them to your particular situation. So as most of you know, there has been a pretty significant increase in PMA requirements around the world, especially in the EU. But the question is why? Well, perhaps, maybe, and I hate to say this about our industry, but maybe it could be that we haven't been doing our jobs very well. What would be my justification for saying that? Well, just look at a couple things very, very recently. Here's a report from is it OMG? This one is not seeing it here. From the Federal Register, Agency Information Collection Activities on the submission. Oh yeah, here it is. Office of Management and Budget Review for post-market surveillance of medical devices. Well, long story short, if OMG starts an investigation, it's usually not because something is being done very well. So this is one of the reasons why I say that our industry, not just over the last few months or years, hasn't done a good job at this, but over decades, we haven't done a very good job of this. And not just the OMG, but the OIG, the Office of the Inspector General, has also got a similar investigation going on. They're looking to assess and describe how FDA's established passive focused market surveillance system, how well it identifies and tracks safety concerns and responds to them. This is stuff that's happening just literally in the last couple of weeks from when we're doing this webinar. So I'm not talking about stuff that's that's been happening, happened 10 or 25 years ago. This is stuff that's going on even as we speak. One of the things that they talk about, I'm not going to get into the details here, is the whole UDI, the Unique Device Identification System, and how that can be used on as part of our PMS. On a personal note, I will just say that I find it fascinating that we as a medical device industry are still struggling and debating on how to implement UDI when Walmart has been using this technology for like 30 years. I think, quite frankly, that's embarrassing. But compliance for the most risky devices, like Class 3 devices, which would include many implantable devices, that's already in effect. The lower risk devices, Class 1 and Class 2 devices, that's still transitioning in. And I also wanted to point out, I'm going to share some guidance with you in a little while, but suffice it to say that there's a new guidance, I'll put the word new in quotes, on post-market surveillance for medical devices coming out next year. And this followed FDA's decision earlier this year to end what was called the Alternative Summary Reporting Program. For those of you that are not familiar with it, you may remember this particular report that came out in the news a few months ago. An investigative report claims that FDA is hiding millions of adverse event reports from public under the guise of an alternative summary reporting program. Simply put, this is, yes, it's a factually correct statement, but it is inherently biased. It is inherently biased. And for those of you that are interested, my friend John Spear and I did a podcast earlier this year specifically on this topic. I would encourage you, if you're interested, to listen to this topic. It also fits under the general umbrella of post-market surveillance. Okay, so next question. Why hasn't our industry, and I want to personalize this here, specifically us, been very good at post-market surveillance in the past? Well, there are a lot of reasons. One is lack of enforcement. Simply put, Congress has not given, and still to this day really has not given FDA the teeth, if you will, the enforcement power to really enforce post-market surveillance requirements. And again, it's not limited to devices. Drug companies are just as guilty, maybe even more guilty of this. So one of the reasons is lack of enforcement. But there are other reasons as well. Here's another. Many, if not most, post-market surveillance studies are simply not done. The simple reality, and I decided at the last minute to drop some of the statistics because I shared with you the OIG and OMG reports that are under investigations that are going on right now. That should speak louder than the statistics. The simple reality is there are a lot of PMS studies that companies will tell FDA that they will do as part of the approval process, and then long story short, they don't finish them, or in some cases, they don't even start them. Why? In some cases, it's because of lack of enforcement. You know, a company will make a calculation. It's better not to do the study and take the risk of getting our hands slapped if we are caught, so to speak. And even if we do get caught, the ramifications are usually not that significant. But here's the real explanation from my friend Anthony Shepsis at BU. Nothing ruins good results better than long-term follow-up. Or my spin on Dr. Shepsis's quote is, there's no better way to avoid finding a problem than not to look for one. You know, we really, regulatory requirements aside, I hope that everybody in this audience agrees that we have an obligation, ethical or otherwise, to keep an eye on our products while they're in use. How much of an eye we keep over what period of time and so on, obviously those questions are worthy of debate, but I think that's the essence of this. I'll give you just a couple of real quick examples from the medical device world. Some of you are probably familiar with stent grafts, which is essentially a combination of two medical devices. It's a combination of a stent and a vascular graft. Stent grafts can be used in a number of different areas. This particular one is for abdominal aortic aneurysms, or AAAs. These things have been around for decades. I remember starting, in the early 90s, and one of the many devices that I worked on were stent grafts like this. And yet we continue to have problems, and not just new problems. We continue to experience the same problems over and over and over again. Here is a FDA Safety Commission communication that came out just a day ago, or 2 days ago, before this particular webinar, on particular problems with what are called endo leaks. I don't want to take the time to talk about endo leaks, but anybody that thinks an endo leak is a new problem, I mean, please, we knew about endo leaks since at least the 1990s, maybe even the 1980s. So the question is, when we collect safety-related information through PMS, it's not enough to simply collect it. We're supposed to act on it. In this particular case, the proof is in the pudding. We don't seem to be acting on it very well. Here's another example, breast implants, the poster child for the importance of post-market surveillance, both in the EU as well as in the US. Just earlier, I think last week, FDA put out an example of a warning for breast implants. Breast implants have been around for decades as well. Look at the first bullet. Breast implants are not considered lifetime devices. And yet, from a regulatory perspective, we call them a permanent implant. The simple reality is breast implants, even though they're regulated as permanent implants, they were never, from the beginning, intended to be in the patient for the rest of their life. How many regular people, I'm not talking about geeky regulatory people like me that work in this industry, but how many regulatory people do you think understand that? They go on to suggest putting these additional warnings in these for these particular devices, but once again, none of these things are new. These things go back years, in some cases decades. And finally, for those of you that work in the combination product side of the world, can you say paclitaxel? Paclitaxel is one of the most commonly used drugs on both drug-eluting stents as well as drug-eluting balloons. It's a chemotherapeutic, but it's also an anti-hyperplastic. That's why we use it in drug-eluting stents and drug-eluting balloons. But recently, and I'm not going to get into the details of this, recently paclitaxel has been associated with a number of problems as well. Even though we have a number of drug-eluting stents and drug-eluting balloons that use paclitaxel, even though we've done what some people might say a lot of clinical testing, a lot of clinical trials, and yet through post-market surveillance, we're still finding problems. The question is why? If our testing is so good, why is it that we find these problems, and specifically, why do we find them after the fact, that is, after the approval as opposed to before? A couple of other things I wanted to talk about under this umbrella of post-market surveillance, and then we'll get on to some questions at the end. What's the relationship between human factors in post-market surveillance? Human factors is obviously very important from a pre-market perspective. Most of you are probably familiar with the two steps, the two parts of human factors testing that we do, the formative followed by the summative human factors testing. Formative we typically do first prior to the design freeze, because that helps us, gives us information that we can use during the design and development process of the device, whereas the summative human factor testing occurs typically after the design freeze. There we're looking for issues or problems or benefits of an existing device, a device that has already been designed. That's typically what happens pre-market. But one thing that's always bothered me is there's a huge piece of this equation that's missing. What's missing? How about post-market PMS? What is the importance of human factor studies after your clearance or approval once the product is on the market? Well, once again, you can go to the FDA. The FDA's website is a great source of information. Here's a section of their website talking about human factors and post-market surveillance. But the question is, talk is cheap. Is this theory or is this reality? Let me share with you one, and I hope two examples to illustrate exactly what I mean. For those of you that are familiar with the Da Vinci surgical robot, this is a classic example of what some people might consider a post-market, well, let me not say post-market, but some people would consider a human factors failure. Watch this video and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
There's no question that the Da Vinci surgical robot, seen here in the marketing video, suturing a grave with precision and ease, can do extraordinary things. The only surgical robot of its kind. Many doctors, like heart surgeon Dr. Robert Poston, seen here using the Da Vinci, are believers.
The patients recover quicker, less blood loss, there's less complications.
That's because there's no big incision. It's laparoscopic surgery on steroids. The robot controls the instruments guided by the doctor at a console.
My ability to be precise is better, even than my own hands.
But the Da Vinci is not without problems. In the last 10 years, there were 22,000 adverse events filed in an FDA database citing a range of issues associated with the Da Vinci, from the most minor malfunctions to 274 deaths. Lori Featherstone, who lives with her daughter in Altoona, Iowa, wishes she'd asked more questions before having robotic surgery.
As you're sleeping right now, are you in pain?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. All the way up and down. Sorry.
3 years ago, her doctor told her she needed a hysterectomy.
She told me that I needed to choose whether to have a robot or a surgeon. And if she were me, she would elect to have the robot. Less downtime, less scarring.
But Lori had serious complications.
Basically, my kidneys were drowning. They found that my ureter had some type of thermal injury.
So somewhere in the course of the surgery, you burned.
Mm-hmm.
Her doctor's post-operative report confirms that, also noting her colon was damaged. She's now facing a permanent colostomy. All this 2 years after Da Vinci's manufacturer, Intuitive Surgical, had been put on notice in a strongly worded letter from the FDA that, among other things, burning was a problem. Sadly, Lori is not alone. NBC News has spoken to more than a dozen patients, many of whom are suing, who say they were burned or otherwise injured during surgery with the Da Vinci, something we saw reported over and over again in FDA documents. Surgeon observed a flame, burn injury to small bowel, a burn injury to the liver. And while Dr. Poston has now performed 1,200 surgeries using the Da Vinci, he tells us before doing his first, he had only 2 hours of practice on the device and is extremely worried about the lack of doctor training.
If you want to fly a commercial airplane, it takes you 1,500 hours. But you can fly a robot after training, which isn't really that rigorous.
In fact, there are no national requirements regulating how much training a surgeon must have to operate using the Da Vinci. The FDA says it doesn't have jurisdiction. And while Intuitive Surgical offers a 4-level training program, it cannot require surgeons to complete it.
The root cause here is the training, the willingness to sell robots to people and promote them doing surgeries when they weren't adequately trained, the willingness of hospital credentialing committees to sign off on them and allow them to do it.
Dr. Poston hopes every surgeon will search his or her own conscience.
We should live in a world where we practice brutal transparency with our patients. So if we lived in that world, we would tell the patient, I'd like to operate on you, but I didn't have the time or money to have all the training that I really think that we ought to have had. Is that okay? Is that okay? Would you be okay with that?
The robot's manufacturer tells NBC News that they, quote, offer a comprehensive intensive training program that depends on the surgeon's capabilities, and that they also strongly recommend that surgeons continue training throughout their careers. Now, Lori Featherstone filed suit against Intuitive, but later voluntarily withdrew it. She says, ask questions.
There's an adage that I used to share with my medical students. Some of you perhaps have heard this. The surgery went perfectly, but the patient died anyway. The medical device equivalent, which I think is applicable here, we designed the medical device perfectly, but the patient died anyway. The regulatory equivalent, which I think also applies here, we followed the regulation perfectly, but the patient died anyway. This is an example of how human factors is very important, not just pre-market, but post-market as well. And by the way, anybody that thinks that these are new problems, they're really not, because this particular video that I shared with you was from last year. It turns out that I have a very similar video also from NBC from 2013 that actually talks about exactly the same problems. So what's the root cause? Is it the lack of training? Well, perhaps, but FDA can't regulate training because that's the practice of medicine. And to simply say that this was, that FDA doesn't have the authority, to me, that's an excuse. That's a cop-out. What about the responsibility of the manufacturer to make sure that people are adequately trained before they can use their device? Were these problems unforeseeable? Were they anticipated risks, to put it in the design control vernacular? Were these problems new? I think, again, it's such an interesting case. We could do an entire discussion just on this case. But I just wanted to share from the post-market surveillance side, why is this so important? And bottom line, the last reason why this is important, linking this back to liability, is because when we don't do our jobs, then we start to see ads like this. Watch this one.
Attention Da Vinci surgical robot patients.
If you had a hysterectomy or prostate surgery performed by the Da Vinci surgical robot and suffered medical complications, call 800-800-1919. If you had to undergo additional surgeries due to complications,
you get the idea. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not trying to use Da Vinci or Intuitive to hold them as a special villain here. On the contrary, they're doing exactly what virtually every other medical device company on earth does. They're following the industry standards. One of the questions that I like to ask, though, is, are our industry standards, our regulation, is it good enough? Okay, continuing on, talking about things like safety. Some of you may not be aware of a new safety motivator or initiative that just came out of FDA very, very recently. It's called the Safer Technologies Program, or STEP. FDA put out a guidance on this just last month. For those of you that are familiar with the Breakthrough Designation Program, or BDP, the STEP is very similar, I would say substantially equivalent to the BDP. And for those of you that are regulatory geeks, you may appreciate my not so subtle use of humor here. The difference compared to the BDP is on safety, though not efficacy. In other words, the device should be reasonably expected to significantly improve the benefit-risk profile of a treatment or diagnostic through substantial safety innovations that provide for one of the more following. And the reason why I'm including it here is because one of the examples in the guidance is a reduction in the occurrence of known use-related hazards or user errors. This smacks directly to usability, human factors, and that's exactly why I'm including it in here. For those of you that are interested in this particular topic, John Spear and I did a podcast on this very, very recently. I would encourage you to listen to that for more information on the STEP program. But this is another example of how we can use post-market surveillance information, in this particular case, to come up with a safer device that we then might be able to get into the STEP program and being able to get it onto the market that much more quickly. So as I said before, PMS is a very broad umbrella. I meant that not just metaphorically, but I meant that in many different reasons. And let me show you an example of where we might be able to use that. This happens to be an example of a combination product, a prefilled syringe called the EpiPen. For those of you that are not familiar with some of the problems that are associated with EpiPen, watch this.
We want to thank you so much for coming. We're so happy.
Hi, we're here for the open house. Hi there.
Sorry, got to get through this little commercial first. Hold on one second.
You also wanted this house, but you use Realtor.com.
With more shows a big rise in complaints offensive this morning.
Mylan, the drug company that created outrage with the dramatic price increase of the EpiPen, is on the defensive this morning. A new report shows a big rise in complaints about the device not working in life-threatening emergencies. Bloomberg says 228 people this year reported failures of EpiPen, which injects a drug that can cause severe allergic reactions. That's up from 2012, when just 4 failures were reported. Tony DeCopel shows us one family's scary experience and Mylan's response to the report. Tony, good morning.
Good morning. Mylan doesn't take issue with the data, but says Bloomberg's article is misleading. It says a rise in reports of failures doesn't necessarily mean a rise in actual failures, and suggests heightened attention on the company and increased prescriptions could be to blame. Of course, for those who depend on the device, any failure is unacceptable.
Watching your child sit there screaming to you, "Don't let me die," is awful for any parent to have to go through.
Tina Hampton's moment of panic was made worse after she reached for an EpiPen. This past spring, her 6-year-old daughter, whom she doesn't want on camera, was gasping for breath after an allergic reaction to peanuts.
And when I pulled it out, the needle did not go back inside of the EpiPen. It was bent.
He sliced her daughter's leg, leaving a scar. She credits a backup EpiPen for saving her child's life. Bloomberg obtained data from the FDA linking 228 reports of EpiPen failures to 7 deaths and 35 hospitalizations this year. The FDA cautions that with its reporting system, there is no certainty that the reported event was due to the product.
It's a very easy device to use, but someone in a panic might use it wrong.
Dr. Scott Fisher is a pediatric allergy expert. He showed us how quickly the EpiPen deploys.
1, 2, 3.
Slow motion gives a better look at how it delivers a dose of epinephrine, just 1 shot per device. In emergencies, he says some folks get confused, holding it the wrong way.
When they press it, they then get the medication into their thumb.
Despite the increase in reports of failures since 2012, Mylan says no changes have been made to the EpiPen device since 2009.
Just got to pause and just make a comment here. So the company has known of these problems with the product for quite some time, and yet they have not made any changes to the product. Comes back to one of the points that I made earlier, and this is not a rhetorical comment. What good is doing post-market surveillance? What good is collecting information if we're not prepared to act on it? I'll leave that as a rhetorical comment. Maybe we can discuss that at the end of the webinar. Here's the rest of the video.
The company says they haven't found a causal connection between reported patient deaths and the EpiPen.
Now, there was a recall of some EpiPens earlier this year due to a defect.
I think for the sake of time, I'm going to continue on. But again, this is such an interesting case. There's so many lessons to be learned of things to do, but also of things not to do. One thing I want to point out, though, in this particular graph that you're seeing on the screen, it clearly shows an increase in adverse events associated with this particular product. This is a combination product, obviously, over the last half dozen years or so. But that is inherently biased. It is absolutely biased. Why? Because it's very, very deceptive. They have not normalized the data. In other words, they're looking at the absolute number of reports, which clearly increases over this particular period of time. But what do we know about the number of uses of the product over that same period of time? So a much less biased way to report this same data, and this is data right from the company and from the FDA, even it's inherently biased, is to normalize this, to divide these numbers by the number of uses of the product in each of those years. That would be a much more, let me say, a much less biased way to look at this particular data. But nonetheless, the point remains, this particular device, this particular combination product rather, has problems. We've identified these problems. And the question is now, what are we going to do about it? Okay. A couple more things to talk about very, very briefly, and then we're going to move on to the questions. How does the system here for PMS in the U.S. compare to that in the Europe? Well, in a nutshell, the PMS requirements in the EU are much, much more significant now than they are in the U.S., at least for now. U.S. PMS requirements are also increasing, but not nearly as much as in the EU. The question is why? Well, for those of you that are familiar with something called the implant files, that's just one example. And let me share with you a short video that talks about this.
We wanted to really test the approval process for medical devices. If we would build a vaginal mesh that was so dangerous and so ridiculous, would we get it through? So we got a net of Mandarin, and we went to the notified body, and we said, would you approve this? And they didn't see any problem.
The story is about things that are implanted into people, an area of medicine that was largely under-regulated, kits that help people to walk, artificial lenses that allow people to see.
Certain devices help people, but you have certain devices that really permanently scar people. It makes sense to team up with a big team of journalists and say, why are these implants hurting the patients in our country?
It's not like drugs. You don't have clinical trials for every device.
A lot of these products are inserted into people without any testing. As patients, people realize that they've been part of the evidence gathering and the experiment.
The 911 call reveals Bridget Robb's raw agony.
Oh, I'm gonna die.
Screaming with each shock of the defibrillator malfunctioning in her chest.
The Pinnacle hip implant, it was not tested in humans before it was sold and surgically implanted.
Many of the companies will come to Europe in the first place to get market experience, and then if the device survives, to take it to America.
And now, instead of the standards getting better, the implanted devices in particular are getting worse. All focus is on getting products to market more quickly, because that's what industry wants.
Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to cut it off. This particular video is available on the internet. There will be a link in the handout for the presentation if you want to watch it. But bottom line, there's been a lot of bad press about some medical devices here in the United States. There's been even more bad press about certain medical devices in the EU. And that, quite frankly, is the root cause. That's what's driving the more regulation in post-market surveillance and more regulation across the board. You know, the simple reality is bad news sells. Good news doesn't sell. We hear about the problems. What we don't hear about, unfortunately, are the thousands and thousands of medical devices that are used every day that do help people. So to steal a metaphor from a tagline from Fox News, I do try to provide a fair and balanced approach. Yes, we have to acknowledge the bad, but we should also acknowledge the good as well. One of the comparisons I sometimes like to make is to compare the FDA to the CIA. Because when the CIA does their job, nobody knows about it. When the CIA doesn't do their job, everybody knows about it. The FDA is exactly the same. And let me tell you, my friends here in the U.S. and the FDA, as well as my reviewer friends in the EU, they are painfully aware of the importance of their decisions. What they ask you as a company to do or not do can end up with them being in the front of an investigational community on Capitol Hill here in the United States, or on the headlines on NBC News or someplace like that. The question is this additional regulation, is it justified? Well, I would say partly, but not completely. Post-market surveillance should be based on the technology and on the risk of the product. By technology, I mean how well established is the technology. If your technology has been around for a very long time, if you have many devices that use the same or similar technology, and if the risks are relatively well understood, then post-market surveillance, it's still important, but it's not that important. We don't have to do it as much because we have a long history of use. On the other hand, if the technology is not well established, if it's brand new, if there are not other products out there that use it, if you're the first to use it, and especially when it comes to risk, if you have a high risk, a class 3 kind of a device, where if your device works, the patient lives, if they don't, the patient dies, now post-market surveillance becomes even much more critical. So to me, absolute regulatory requirements are not necessary. In fact, they're actually problematic. They're actually dangerous. We should take the intent of the regulation and try to understand it and apply it to our particular situation. So my recommendation here is always to do what makes sense from an engineering and a biology perspective in your particular situation, and then document your justification for why you're doing it. And don't just document what you're doing, but you should also document what you're not doing and why you're not doing it. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense from a regulatory perspective, but for reasons we won't get into here, from a product liability perspective, that can be a little problematic. In terms of doing what makes sense, let me share with you one of my favorite sections of the FDA's website on the quality side. This is what I call the preamble to the whole QMS system. And I'm going to read just a portion of it to you. It says, regulation must apply to so many different types of medical devices that the regulation does not prescribe in detail how a manufacturer must produce a specific device. Rather, the regulation provides a framework that all manufacturers must follow that requires the manufacturer to develop and follow procedures, fill in the details that are appropriate to a given device, a given technology, a given company, and so on. Manufacturer, and this is all applicable to post-market surveillance. I could scratch off QMS and put PMS. It's the same thing here. Manufacturers should use good judgment when developing their quality system, when developing their post-market surveillance system, and apply the sections of the QMS that are applicable to their specific products and operations. It's the responsibility of each manufacturer to establish requirements for their particular type or family of devices that will result in devices that are safe and effective, and so on. And finally, the essential elements of a quality system, or again, scratch and put that post-market surveillance system, shall embody without prescribing specific ways to establish these elements. Because QS regulation and PMS regulation covers a broad spectrum of devices, product processes, and so on, it allows some leeway, I would argue a lot of leeway, in the details of the quality system. It's left to the manufacturer to determine the necessity for or extent of some quality elements and to develop and implement specific procedures tailored to their particular process and devices. Bottom line, when it comes to PMS, when it comes to virtually all regulation across the board, it's not supposed to be standard. It's not supposed to be universal. It's not supposed to be cookie cutter. It's not supposed to be one size fits all. It's designed, at least it should be designed, to be customizable, to be personalizable, because the challenges that you face in your company with your device and your technology might be very, very different than the company, the medical device company just up the street or across the country from you. The logic should be applied to all regulation, including post-market surveillance regulation, no exceptions. So what's my takeaway message here? Don't just follow the rules, think. Douglas MacArthur said rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind. I get frustrated when I run into so many people in our industries. Clearly, I'm stereotyping here. Not everybody, who seem to be more concerned about following the regulation like a recipe, like a computer executing lines of code one after another, without ever asking the question, does it make sense? Finally, the last thing I want to talk very briefly about is post-market surveillance when it comes to combination products. That's really a topic for a different discussion, or is it? There's a lot of overlap. FDA put out a couple of recent guidances for combo products. I'll just give you pointers to them for right now. This one came out this past summer that basically says that you need to report safety problems for all of the constituent parts in the combination product, and you need to share this information with all of the different players that are involved, different manufacturers. I mean, to me, this is a statement of the obvious. I mean, do we really need a guidance? Do we really need FDA telling this? And they provide two hypothetical examples, although their hypothetical examples are actually based on real-world experience. One is for a combination product where the primary mode of action is a drug, it's a pre-filled syringe, and the primary regulatory pathway to market is the NDA, the new drug approval. And then the second is PMOA of a device, it's a drug-eluting stent, where the primary regulatory pathway to market is the PMA, the pre-market approval. Administratively, how we handle this reporting to the agency, granted, is a little bit complicated. What forms we use, unfortunately, CDRH and CDER uses different forms. That's problematic on so many levels, I won't even go into that. But the logic is exactly the same. The logic of how we report these things is exactly the same. And on the drug side of the world, here's a recent guidance just came out earlier this month on drug post-market surveillance. And I guarantee, you can say you heard it here first, I guarantee that maybe much of what you're seeing in this drug guidance is going to show up pretty quickly in the new PMS guidance for medical devices coming out next year that I talked about. So for the sake of time, I won't talk about the details of it. You can take a look at that guidance. We talked a little bit about how we can use PMS for label expansions, whether we're getting that information from a randomized clinical trial, which would be a post-market, a post-approval study, which is what we call it in the device side of the world, or a phase 4 study, which is what we call it on the drug side of the world. But my favorite would be to use real-world evidence, which is not part of a clinical trial. And finally, the last thing to just mention very, very quickly, looking to the future, is what are the PMS challenges for personalized products, personalized drug devices or drugs, like, for example, what we're starting to do with 3D printing today. Well, let me just say, as a regulatory expert, our current, and also as a professional biomedical engineer, our current regulation is totally inadequate when it comes to post-market surveillance for personalized products. And suffice it to say, we're going to have to probably take a personalized approach. In other words, personalized products, personalized medical devices. If we're making a medical device for one patient and only one patient, that's going to require some form of what I call personalized post-market surveillance. It's not an overly burdensome thing. It doesn't have to be. There are ways, I've suggested many ways to FDA to start thinking about how we can do this, but these are all solvable problems. So to wrap this up, we've talked about a lot of different things under the big umbrella of post-market surveillance. I ask you to remember this adage: there's no better way to avoid finding a problem than not to look for one. Or put a slightly different way, what's the best way to ensure that we have more regulation in the future? It's very simple. It's when companies and the people in them, meaning us, continue to do stupid things. And regrettably, as a regulatory consultant, I see companies and the people in them do stupid things every single week, sometimes even every single day. So if you want to have less regulation in the future, do what makes sense. I like to think that this is a two-way street. In other words, obviously, if companies continue to do stupid things, that will have more regulation, but I would like to also think that if companies don't do stupid things and stop doing stupid things, that we would actually maybe have less regulation in the future. I would love to work in an industry, I would love to live in a world where we wouldn't need an FDA, where companies and the people in them would do the things that we all know we're supposed to do, but we don't always do them. Unfortunately, I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday, but we can certainly strive for that. At this point, that concludes the formal discussion. I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes for some Q&A and discussion. I want to thank John and my other friends at Greenlight for the opportunity to conduct this webinar today. I want to thank all of you in the audience. If there's anything that I can do to help, you've got my contact information. Feel free to email me or give me a call. Happy to help however I can. John, why don't you take it from here?
Sure. Thank you, Mike, so much. Great information, jam-packed, a little over an hour, jam-packed. I mean, there's so much here and really good stuff. So folks, thank you so much for participating, and thanks for those who submitted questions. Just an anecdote, we did get a couple of people who chimed in about whether or not their PMS process has improved or stayed the same. Thank you, Aaron, for sharing that your PMS process has significantly improved over the past 5 years. But let's get to some questions. And folks, advanced apologies. I am going to do my best to pronounce your name correctly, so bear with me if I don't. But Donya asked, do you have an estimation of underreporting of device-related events that are not adverse events?
Device-related events that are not adverse events. That's an interesting. So sometimes in the regulatory world for devices and for drugs both, we distinguish between significant adverse events versus adverse events. I'm not sure if that's what the person is referring to, John, or if they're referring to things that are not adverse events at all. I guess my question would be, if it's not an adverse event, what is it? Is it a good thing? Is it that the device performed better, or they did something different than they were able to do before? I don't know, John. Do you have any context of that question?
I don't have any more context. I can speculate that maybe this has to do with if there are some sort of just events that are issues that don't quite escalate to adverse events, but I don't know. So Donya, if you have any additional context for your question, please take a moment and chime in. But let's move on to the next question in the meantime.
Actually, John, before we do, just one thing I would add real quick. We all know, I didn't mention it in the webinar because I already tried to cover an awful lot, but we all know that underreporting is a huge issue for a variety of different reasons. And what I can say is that the likelihood that a particular event, whether we call it adverse or significant or whatever it is, the likelihood of a particular event being reported is going to be directly proportional to the severity or the impact of that event. In other words, if a particular medical device is used and a patient dies or experiences some very significant adverse event, then I guarantee the manufacturer is going to hear about it. But on the other hand, if a medical device is used and maybe, it's a catheter and, the hub of the catheter, comes off and the cardiologist takes it out and just replaces it with a new catheter, maybe, that event might not get reported because, quite frankly, they don't want to spend the time doing it, right? So underreporting is a huge issue. And, when I started out in this business as an R&D engineer about 25 years ago, I spent a lot of my time doing what I call failure mode recreation. So you have a medical device that was used in the field and some problem happened. We tried to then recreate the circumstances that led to that problem to determine whether it was a design issue, a manufacturing issue, a material issue, a user issue, whatever. And the most difficult problem with that process, John, and if you have experience on this, you can share it as well, is only in the most significant, only in the most severe situations did we really get enough information to adequately recreate that problem. Most of the time, when a device came back, they would say, yeah, here's the problem, and not say anything more about it. So underreporting is a problem. Recreating these failure modes is a problem. There are a lot of challenges, but this goes back to what I talked about earlier, active versus passive post-market surveillance. If you have a problem that's reported to you, if you don't have enough information, maybe the company needs to go back to whoever reported and dig deeper. Not required, but maybe something to think about.
Yeah, so Donya provided a little bit more context. She offers an event that is not an adverse event could be any defect with no impact on safety, such as cosmetic difficulties to use, etc.
Oh, I see. Thank you, Donya, for the qualification. So now, John, this is what I would kind of call a quality event, right? So if you have a device that leaves your facility that doesn't meet the quality specs, you know, maybe the size is a little off, maybe there's a scratch in it, maybe it's you know, the color is a little off or something like that. You know, now my question, talk about root cause, is, okay, how the heck did it leave your company?
Yeah, it's a good thing to think about. You know, and I think.
But how many of those are reported, John? I have no idea.
Yeah, that's a hard thing to estimate too, I'm sure. All right, next question comes from Brandon. Brandon states, I'm using the safety information from IMDRF and Implant Files websites to actively search for product issues in different countries. Are there other good specific places to actively look for device issues? And then he provides a link to the IMDRF website and Implant File website. But any thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, great question. What was that person's name again, John?
Brandon.
Brandon. So great question, Brandon, and kudos to you for doing that, because only for very high-risk devices, like, for example, here in the U.S., there is a regulatory requirement for PMA devices. It's part of the PMA submission, that you need to look for problems with similar devices, not just here in the U.S., but in other places in the world as well. That requirement does not exist for 510K and de novo devices, although perhaps it should. And I can tell you my general policy at FDA is to always look for, you know, to take a broader, a global picture. So if I walk into the FDA store with a device that we want to get onto the market here in the U.S. right now, if I have that device on the market in other places, like in the EU, for example, I will include as part of my pre-sub, for example, its history of use in other places. And I will say, you know, we are being good corporate citizens because here's problems that have happened in other places, and here's what we're doing here in the United States to prevent them. I was working with a company a couple of years ago where they were trying to get a product onto the market in Canada, and Health Canada was asking them for a history of use in the other places in the world where it's already been using. And the company was a little surprised by that. And I said to the company, why the heck are you surprised? I said, that's Health Canada's job. Health Canada is trying to prevent any known problems that happened in other places to prevent it from happening, in this case, in Canada. So in terms of the specific response to the question, Brandon, yeah, there are other resources that you can use, other databases that you can use. As I alluded to earlier, you know, FDA's got several complaint-related databases. If you send me an email or if you give me a call, I'd be happy to give you some specific references. But much more importantly to me than those references is the fact that you're doing this, because regrettably, this is not something that everybody does.
Yeah, and not to throw any water on your fire there, Brandon, because I think I agree with Mike. I've heard a rumor. I haven't seen a source to corroborate this, but the Unimed database that we've long been anticipating for the EU, I've heard that that's been delayed So anyway, we don't have to.
I heard the
dive
same
into-
thing, John. I saw something come across
dive
my
into it
email
today.
just a few days ago that it's going to be delayed, I think, a couple of years. And look, I don't want to be overly critical, but to me, that's inexcusable. And I've said this in Europe many times. You know, the Unimed database should have been publicly available many, many years ago. Why? But you know, coming from the U.S., of course, they don't listen to me. You know, so.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, all right. So Aaron, let's dive into Aaron's comment and then question. So first of all, Mike, Aaron wants to let you know that you did a fantastic presentation, and then on to his question.
Thank you, Aaron.
It's about the no EpiPen changes since 2009, and he states maybe this is because if they make changes, they need new approval. Maybe FDA should have an expedited review approval process for changes made specifically to address PMS adverse events.
That's a great comment, and I have to be a little careful here because I have been involved with the EpiPen situation, both from a regulatory consulting perspective as well as a product liability perspective. But I will say this: Aaron, is it?
Yes.
Is that? Yeah, Aaron does make a good point. Unfortunately, there are regrettably many companies that will not change a product for fear that that's going to cause problems with the FDA, that maybe they have to go through a new submission, a lot more paperwork, and so on. And let me tell you, I understand, you know, that reasoning. I mean, to quote a famous politician, I feel their pain, but that is exactly what gives FDA and regulation a bad name. If we have gone so far as to create regulatory disincentives to improve products, and in this particular case, to make them better, to make them safer, then how could anybody argue that our regulatory system is working the way we want it to work? That's a problem. So, Aaron, it's a great question. Thank you for bringing it up, and it's something that all of us need to think and to talk about more.
Yeah, and Aaron, as a preview of something, a conversation that Mike and I are going to have real soon, there is I think the FDA is cognizant of this. I think that's part of the motivation for their case for quality initiative, and there's actually some recent news about the case for quality initiative where they're kind of opening up the participation to that program. But I think one of the driving forces behind that case for quality initiative was just the point that you made, is that there have been lots of regulatory hurdles and disincentives for companies to make changes. And so sometimes companies unfortunately sit on changes that are best for patient, best for the quality of the product because of the obstacles and challenges from a regulatory perspective. So I know it's probably not happening fast enough, but I think there is some interest in improving that. And by the way, Mike, Aaron adds one more comment that you might enjoy the book called The Danger Within Us by Gene Lenzer, and it's about America's untested, unregulated medical device industry. So that's an interesting book. I might have to check that out myself.
Yeah, that sounds. I appreciate the tip, Aaron. I'll definitely look into that. John, I would just add one last quick comment, and then maybe we can wrap this up. I know, obviously, the focus of today's webinar was on post-market surveillance, but shifting back to the pre-market side, I also see, regrettably, a lot of medical device companies where, as a matter of corporate policy, they say to their R&D engineers, only change this existing device to the point that we can handle that change via a letter to file. Do not go past that magic line where that change is going to cause us to go back to the FDA with a special 510K or a PMA supplement or something like that. And as a former R&D engineer, John, that just makes my blood pressure shoot through the roof. Because can anybody imagine a stronger disincentive to make products better than what I just described? Regulation is not supposed to be an obstacle. I refuse, I said this in a presentation at DIA just yesterday, I refuse to use regulation as an excuse to hold us back. We have too many people in this industry that blame FDA, that blame regulation. We can't do this, we can't do that. We need to work with the regulation, with the FDA, to figure out how to make our products better and ultimately make the world a better place. That's maybe a little naive, John, but that's my goal.
Yeah, and folks, I know we're really at the tail end or at the hard stop for today's presentation. I know there's a few questions from Shaylee, from Marie, Leslie, Kenneth, and quite a few others. Folks, feel free to reach out to Mike with those direct questions. You can contact him directly. So he's some really good details that are in there. And Aaron, thanks again so much for that book reference. I've added it to my Audible wish list, so it'll be in my my headphones here real soon. Sounds like a really fantastic read. And Brandon, thank you so much. Brandon says it is official that the EEC European Commission has confirmed a 2-year UTMed delay. So, it's on MedTech Drive. The URL is a bit long, but it is official as of this morning. So, Mike, thank you so much for all the time, effort, and energy you put into this presentation on post-market surveillance for medical devices and combination products. And those of you who participated in this event, thank you as always. We love doing these programs with Mike and our other partners here at Greenlight Guru. So be sure to check out all of the previous webinars we've ever done are available on demand. You can watch them at your leisure, and there are a lot. I would also encourage you to check out the Global Medical Device Podcast, the #1 podcast in the medical device industry. We've done 100 and gosh, I don't even remember, well over 100 episodes now, and myself and Mike have lots of conversations on many of those episodes. Be sure to check that out as well. And of course, if there's anything we can do at Greenlight Guru to help you in your quest to embrace true quality, I would encourage you to reach out to us at www.greenlight.guru to learn more about the Greenlight Guru EQMS software platform designed specifically and exclusively for the medical device industry by actual medical device professionals. Again, thank you so much. And